Holder back to us again. And he's been a beloved speaker in the past. And speaking of men of change, he is one. And I'll just give you a quick little bio that he has been ordained as Unity Minister since 2011, co-founder of Project Sanctus, and it's a safe, brave, and online space to discover and be our holiest self. He likes to think of himself as creating a world of love and justice and liberation for all. He also has spiritual counseling. He does grief and bereavement counseling and is an expert in the Enneagram. And he hosts 2 podcasts, Pub Theology Live and With Love and Justice for All. And in that, I will welcome Rev Ogun with our talk today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me again. It is always a pleasure to connect with you, even across the oceans. I am currently in Barbados. Don't hate the messenger, but it is beautiful, sunshiny, and warm here, as advertised. When we talk about how do we create the life we want to experience after 6 years in Massachusetts, I was done with winter. So kudos to you Canadians who just keep on doing it. Love you for it. And here's where I am. So I'm glad that we exist in a space where technology allows me to connect with you in real time and share with you. And I want to echo what Marilyn just said about the power of that music video we just saw. And this really is what I want to talk about today, about how we harness that power of love and create what we call beloved community. But before I jump in to that, I want to invite you to, as I talk over the next 15, 20, 25 minutes, to really notice what's going on in your body as I say the things I say. Some of the things that I say, you're going to have some real like, oh, yes, that's what I'm talking about. I align with that. You're going to feel a little bit of a surge of dopamine and adrenaline as you're like, yes. And then I'm going to say some things also that are more going to be like, oh, like just a little gut punch. And you're going to have some different feelings, some different emotions. Your body's going to tell you different things. Notice without judgment what is arising. This is the beginning of transformative, embodied transformative work, to notice what's happening inside of our bodies. Don't assign meaning, because we are meaning making machines, and anything that happens in our life, it's got to mean something. And we do this simply because we want to feel safe and comfortable. But that's a whole other talk for a whole other time. But resist the temptation to assign meaning. Resist the temptation to figure out what it is that's happening. Just take a note. Just notice. If you want to jot down exactly what you heard when your body did the thing that it did, do that. That's the extent of it. But just notice and breathe. And let's acknowledge that, yes, it is Black History Month, and a cause for celebration of the contributions of Black folk over the history of both Canada and the US, really around the world. It is a month to celebrate acknowledgements, milestones, inventions, contributions, all the things. We live in this paradox where, yes, it is a month of celebration, but then it's also a month where we notice continually almost the opposite of giving us cause for celebration. We know that systemic oppression still exists, discrimination still exists. We hold, as you guys are holding in your theme, consciousness for peace, yet it looks like the opposite continues to happen. We see what's going on in the Middle East right now, and that it's on the edge of being worse. And there are already rumblings about, all these other countries now beginning to tangentially get involved, and it could erupt into something greater. And we're all kind of like collectively on edge and holding our breath. At least I am. I'll speak for myself. So we coexist in these two spaces, and as we continue to hold the vision and work towards peace on earth, and what Martin Luther King Jr. popularized as beloved community, which I'll get into more detail later. Um, it, 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 it's important to just note briefly how we got to the point where we are. And Martin Luther King talked about these three evils. He talked about poverty, racism, and militarism. I also aligned with what the author Bell Hooks talks about. She talks about white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. I think these are all, they're both the same things by different names, if you will. And these systems have coexisted in our nations, in the US and Canada, from the time colonists arrived. And as much change and transformations happen in these countries, those systems still underlie basically how things function. And we thought in 2020 we were beginning to get a glimpse of something huge happening. We began to get a glimpse of maybe a global reckoning with racial disparities after the murder of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter and protests happening all over the world. People marching. I'm sure some of you on this call might have been in marches. I know I was in marches, and people letting their voices be heard, and things began to shift, and we were beginning to feel an energy of like, yes, this is it. This is the turning point. This is where things begin to happen. And then we got the pushback. We got the pushback from those who did not want their seats of power usurped by equity, by justice. We heard about wokeness as a bad thing. We heard about, we can't talk about CRT. We can't talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion anymore. All of a sudden, the desire for a world where we see each other purely because of who we are, not what we look like, was suddenly labeled as a political strategy. And therefore, if you were aligned with it, that meant you were of a certain political persuasion, and all these things were very intentional, and the goodwill of people to find harmony was weaponized. And here we are, seemingly going on 4 years since that seemed like the beginning of an energetic and conscious shift at a global level. Some of us might be feeling just as helpless, or even more than before. Like we really thought we had something there. And I can't tell you how many people I've heard saying it feels like nothing's changed. After all of that, it feels like we're still where we started. I feel so helpless. I don't know what to do. I still hear that. I want to tell you that helplessness is a lie of oppression. There are so many things we can do. There are so many ways we can be in order to shift how the world experiences itself. And I think what happened was we got caught up in the immediacy of it. We got caught up in the hope that the transformation would happen in very short, quick order, forgetting that it took us hundreds of years to get here. We're not going to flip it on a dime. But the work that we do now lays the groundwork, continues to lay the groundwork, builds on the groundwork that was previously laid to creating something new, creating a system of, again, what Martin Luther King referred to as the beloved community. So please know that everything you do towards that is a step in the direction of creating that experience that we truly say we want to have. And the term beloved community was first coined in the earliest days of the 20th century by a philosopher, Josiah Royce, who founded the Fellowship of Reconciliation. So Martin Luther King didn't come up with the term or the concept, but he popularized it. He was also a founding member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or rather was a member of it, and they can lay claim as to be one of the largest, oldest interfaith peace and justice organizations in the US. Give them a look up if you never heard of them. They've done some tremendous work behind the scenes. You've heard of the Freedom Riders back in the civil rights days. Well, they helped co-sponsor those freedom rides as well. So Martin Luther King, based on this concept or this term, laid out both principles and steps towards how we can create this beloved community. And today I'm going to talk about the principles behind it. Next week, I'll talk about the steps, because having principles is all well and good, but we still got to have how to. How do we enact those principles? How do we live those principles? It's no different than our spiritual principles. They sound great on paper, right? But then how do we actually live them on a daily basis? How do we live every day dismantling systems of white supremacy, of militarism, of capitalism, of patriarchy? I forgot to show you, we're wearing a patriarchy shirt. It says destroy the patriarchy, not the planet. That's my prop. My seminary professor would be proud. I wore a prop. So let's talk about the beloved community. And it's often quite misunderstood, if you ever heard the term before from Martin Luther King Jr. And we have this idea, and spiritual communities are often guilty of this. The beloved community means, oh, we have this welcoming space where everybody can come show up and be themselves. We have this space that feels good and loving, and there's no tension. We just relaxed and loving. We envision a very kumbaya experience, a very feels nice to be here experience. Many times that's what we envision. That's not what Dr. King meant by beloved community. In fact, he actually recognized that conflict was an inevitable part of our human experience. And part of a beloved community was about how we can resolve conflict peacefully, and adversaries could be reconciled through a mutual and determined commitment to nonviolence. So he never said we wouldn't have people who disagreed with us. He never said we wouldn't have conflict. What he said was, let's create a container and experience a community, global and local, such that when disagreements and conflict arises, because of our commitment to nonviolence, and we're going to really dig into that nonviolence part a little bit later, because of that commitment, now we can resolve them peacefully. Part of his vision for beloved community was a time and where poverty, hunger, and homelessness would not be tolerated because of our human decency. Where we can all share the wealth that the earth can provide for us, where racism and bigotry and prejudice are replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. He envisioned that instead of using military power to resolve international disputes, there's peaceful conflict resolution, and that love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. And again, it sounds really good on paper. And again, as we listen to it, I remember the first time reading and hearing about this, it was like, yes, that's what I want. That's the world I want to live in. That's the world I think we all want to live in. And for him, a core value of that beloved community was agape love. Many of you are familiar with that term, agape. But the idea of agape love is that we don't discriminate between worthy and unworthy people. We just love people because they exist. That's it. I am worthy and lovable because I exist. You are worthy and lovable simply because you exist. Like you don't have to prove it in any shape or form. Agape love doesn't make a distinction between friends and enemies, between me and you. It's the idea of we are both givers and receivers of that love. It manifests as we choose a path of nonviolence, and we need to be committed and trained in the philosophy of methods, because nonviolence doesn't just happen. We hear nonviolence, and what we think is often, absence of violence, therefore it means I don't get involved in any conflict. It means we hear nonviolence and we think absence of conflict. Some cases, we take it to mean conflict avoidance. All my Enneagram 9s and conflict avoiders in the house. If you know, you know. That's, you know, yeah. I can, I can, I can attest to that myself. So yeah. But that's not what nonviolence is. Nonviolence is not passive. It is not inaction. It is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, acting, and engaging that leads to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. Let me say that again. Nonviolence is a love-centered way of thinking, speaking, acting, and engaging. Okay? Thinking, speaking, acting, and engaging. Neither of those four things are passive or inactive. Acting, engaging. Love-centered ways that lead to personal, cultural, and societal transformation. And if you're interested in really digging into all of this, he really highlights this in his first book, Stride Towards Freedom. And you can also visit, there's a website, the King Center for Nonviolence has a lot of information and resources about this as well. Dr. King said he often got his inspiration from Jesus and his techniques from Gandhi. And those are, I think, a pretty good combination to work on. And when you think about those people, yes, they all said very moving, heart-centered, love-centered things that we repeat in our lives a lot. But those two men were not men of inaction at all. In fact, I often say, like, Jesus was the ultimate troublemaker. He'd show up, he'd do things, that would create a stir. And just as people were worked up, as many of the Gospels write, he suddenly disappeared from their midst and he went back to the desert. So Jesus showed up, stirred up trouble, and then hightailed it out of town. And I'm like, I like that game plan. I can get behind that. Let the people figure it out for themselves later. But the idea is, yes, in order to often disrupt the system of oppression, we have to make ourselves and each other uncomfortable. And part of that discomfort begins with our own internal beloved community. Are we creating beloved community within ourselves first? And I shouldn't say first. I should say in conjunction with the external beloved community. It's a both and, because as we seek to create it outside of ourselves, we will be triggered around the lack of beloved community within ourselves. And as we create it within ourselves, we will feel the need to be in action with it outside of ourselves. So it's a both and. So let's look at these principles of nonviolence. And again, as we go through these, just take a notice what's going on inside of you. In fact, let's do a quick check in it. Just take a moment. I see some of you write notes. Just take a moment, put the pen, pencil down. Just close your eyes briefly, take a breath and check in with yourself. How am I feeling right now? Ask yourself, how am I feeling? Is there any points of discomfort or tension with anything he just said? Even if there's a sense of, got to hear this all over again. A sense of resistance. Just notice. And again, seek not to create meaning, just notice. So let's look at these 6 principles of nonviolence. And the first one is nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. He goes on to say that it's not a method for cowards, and he often didn't mince words. It's not a method for cowards. It is an active resistance to evil. And we'll talk a little bit about his idea and concept of evil as we come up. But it's active nonviolent resistance. He says, and he uses this phrase, it is spiritually, mentally, and emotionally aggressive. spiritually, mentally, and emotionally aggressive. When you think of nonviolence, the word aggression doesn't come to mind, does it? But here's what I think he's meaning when he says spiritually, mentally, and emotionally aggressive. I think he means not waiting for something to happen, but rather taking the initiative, leaning on our spiritual beliefs, living our spiritual beliefs, living our following our emotional catalyst of when we feel morally outraged by injustices happening in the world, to harness that and to use that as the fuel to propel us into conscious action. That's what I think he means by that aggression, not becoming enraged, not allowing anger to take control of us, but rather harnessing it and using it as part of what allows us to step into that courage. So, a way of life for courageous people. Nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. So the outcome of nonviolence is the creation of beloved community, and it is also seeks an end result of redemption and reconciliation. This is the point: friendship and understanding. Nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice or evil, not people. Injustice or evil, not people. So two things from that I want us to take away. One, he's equating injustice with evil. Okay. I know sometimes in spiritual communities, we often maybe hold on to a concept of there's no such thing as evil because there's only good. God is good. God is omnipotence. God is all there is. Therefore, there's only good. There isn't evil. So we have to make the distinction between that as a spiritual concept and what we are experiencing in the world. And when there is injustice, there is evil, as in there is the opposition to that spiritual idea of good being manifested. So we have the spiritual idea of all there is good, all there is God, all there is love, whatever name you want to put in that space. And then in the sensory plane manifestation, what we experience from day to day, how we live our lives. Evil is, again, the injustices that stand in the way of all of us experiencing that, of the creation of beloved community. So that's what the nonviolence is seeking to address. Not the people who represent, not the people who are the faces of injustice or the faces of evil. And it's really hard to sparse those apart, aren't they? But we have to remember that we are all products of this culture. We are all products of a culture that is rooted in the systems of oppression, the ones he talked about: racism, militarism, poverty, the ones Bell Hook talked about that I mentioned, white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. We grew up in these systems. It's hard to imagine an existence outside of those. In fact, we're doing a book study right now of a project scientist called Hospice in Modernity. And the idea is, modernity, or how we got here to this present time built on those systems, is not sustainable. It's already beginning to fall apart. We're seeing the destruction it's doing to ourselves and our planet, and it's not sustainable. It's already dying. So can we consciously hospice that system out and usher in what's new? But the challenge is, how can we imagine what's new outside of those systems? Because that's all we've ever known. So we have no frame of reference. We have no representation of what could be opposite. The best we can do often is sometimes look back to indigenous communities and use some of them sometimes as our model, but those communities did not exist at the time when they were in their heyday, with all our modern conveniences. And we just can't get rid of our modern conveniences. If we did, I wouldn't be zooming to you right now. So I'm not saying we get rid of the modern conveniences, but we have to figure out a way to live and create from them and with them without all the exploitation and the capitalism and all the things. So if you're interested in doing some deep diving into that, check out our book club. I'll share the link with you later. So it's not about the people. It's not about the people. The fourth principle, nonviolence holds that unearned voluntary suffering for a just cause can educate and transform people and societies. And this one is also very challenging for me personally, because what he's saying is sometimes as we do this work, we will find ourselves in harm's way. And I don't know about you, I'm not just conflict avoidant, I'm also pain avoidant. I don't want to be in a place where my physical self is harmed, where even my emotional self is harmed. But what he's saying is that if we're going to live these principles of nonviolence towards creating the beloved community, we might get in harm's way. Harm might come to us. And are we willing to accept that without retaliation, without striking back? And that's a tough one. I see the images of what the folks during the civil rights era had to endure. I see what Black folk and Indigenous people have to endure today in terms of violence meted towards them by law enforcement a lot of times, and justly. And there's that piece of me that really wonders, if I am in a situation where I'm in harm's way, will I stand? Or will I shrink away because I'm pain avoidant? I don't know yet. But I'd like to think that I would. I'd like to think that, back to principle one, I have that level of courage within me. And to know that when that harm is brought towards me and I endure it, that others who bear witness will be inspired. And we saw this during the civil rights era, when as television was beginning to show up in all the households across America, those who could afford them, and they saw the images of nonviolent protesters, of people living the principles of nonviolence, having violence done to them. It shifted thoughts, it shifted consciousness. And we saw this as we witnessed the video of George Floyd being murdered. We see this now in real time in Gaza, as we see the atrocities happen there. The attitudes around the world are beginning to shift. I mean, who would have thought in a million years South Africa would have brought Israel to court, right, about the atrocities? If you'd have told me that was going to happen 5 years ago, I'd been like, that's insane, because the majority of the world is in alignment with the idea of Israel, and many still are. But you can be in alignment with the idea of Israel and not support the just unfettered violence that's happening. Both things can happen at the same time. So we find ourselves in this position where, when we witness the atrocities of violence upon those who are not retaliating back, who don't have the means to retaliate back, it begins to shift. Nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. It is spontaneous, unselfish, it is creative, and it resists violence both externally and internally as well. And the sixth principle, nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. Dr. King phrased it as, God is a God of justice. Many of you know that quote, that he popularized: the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Another quote, by the way, he didn't originate. That was an abolitionist, Theodore Parker, before him. Dr. King just has this gift of taking some really obscure things that many of us would not have heard of and propelling them into the zeitgeist. So this idea that we believe and live the principle that, yes, we are skewing towards justice because this is a divine mandate. For me, spiritual justice, that's what I like to refer to it now as. Spiritual justice is this idea that we are going to come into alignment with that spiritual ideal of oneness. Remember, I talked about, God as good on a consciousness spiritual level. To make that happen at our physical level, I believe that's what we're called to. That's our cycle of creation, our cycle of manifestation. That's what we're called to do through these principles of nonviolence. And when we live these when we live these principles of nonviolence, this is how we create the beloved community. Dr. Cornel West said, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. So when we speak of justice, it's usually understood as maybe like the righting of wrongs. So some injustices were happening, so therefore justice is the correction of those wrongs. I see it in a broader idea. I see the righting of wrongs more like accountability. Okay. But for me, justice is this idea that we're creating systems or recreating systems so that injustices never happen in the first place. You're familiar with the principle of ahimsa, the Hindu principle of do no harm. What if we created systems of existence so that no harm was ever done to anyone? What if we lived our personal lives doing our own inner transformation, spiritual work, so that we don't harm ourselves? What if we lived in such a way that we don't feel afraid or threatened and harm another person simply with our words? For me, that's justice. The cessation of harm even before it begins. And when we are in beloved community, when we build beloved community using these principles of nonviolence, I believe that's both the inner and the outer world that we are creating. So the question I want you to be with this week as you review these principles is, are you willing? And before you just jump and say yes, because your brain is like, oh, of course, this is who we are. This is what we do. We unity folk, we spiritual folk, we anti-racist folk, we are justice seeking folk. So of course we're going to do that. Take a little time with each one and really notice again as you read them and what they're asking of you, how your body feels. Is there willingness or is there a pushback? Is there an embracing or is there resistance? Is there tension or is there just a pliable willingness? Take time to notice and be honest with yourself. Next week, we will talk about some actual steps towards living these principles. But first, yes, spend some time asking yourself if you're willing to embrace. And because you may not be willing to embrace one, doesn't mean you abandon all six. It's not an all or nothing sort of situation. Let's start with where you're at and work your way up. Okay. So, a couple of resources I want to leave you with before we jump into our meditation. I'll put them in the chat. Don't click on them now. Click on them later. You'll get. You should be able to get them in the chat later, or but I'll leave them there for you. It's both the book study that I mentioned. It's also a new program that we just started, is a self-paced anti-racism, conscious anti-racism learning program that you can do in your own time, be challenged in your own time, do your healing work and transformation around racial identity and racial inequities in your own time, on your own pace. So we have that program as well. And finally, the reason this talk came about actually was I write a newsletter. It's called Necessary Trouble, a quote, an invitation from the late, great Reverend John Lewis. And he says sometimes we have to get in necessary trouble. So the Substack is a newsletter you can read online, or it comes straight to your email inbox, and you can sign up for it at the link there. And one of your folk read it and said, "Can you come speak to this?" Because the news that I wrote was, please let 2024 be the year we finally get serious about working and living these anti-racism principles, these nonviolence principles. We spent the last 3 years, many of us for the first time, really educating ourselves. And now that the pushback is really beginning to, for some of us, they might be the fatigue of we've been fighting this fight for these years and nothing's changed and all of that stuff. Let this year be the year we make it very personal, very personal. A part of it is embracing and living these principles of nonviolence. I want to invite us now into a short meditation before we wrap up service. So if you are willing, I invite you to close your eyes. If you would rather keep them open because you feel better that way, you can keep them open as well. And first, take a moment to check in with your body and how it feels right now. Again, noticing any points of tension, any points of discomfort. And then as you notice, gently and slowly shift your attention to your breath. And I want to invite you to, if there were any places within you of discomfort, breathe and extend that breath into those spaces. As we breathe, we center into this knowing that as the embodiment of love, as the embodiment of source, as the embodiment of spirit, of God, of all that is, we have the potential and the power to create heaven on earth. We know that we have the potential and the strength to endure all that is necessary to create beloved community, to shift from foundations of evil to the experience of good for all, of love for all, of justice for all. This is what we've been invited to do. This is who we've been invited to be. This is our calling to create a world of love, justice, and liberation, to create beloved community. To let the presence of love be felt, be seen, be heard. I'm grateful for each and every one of you today, doing your part to bring love into the reality of our world today. And so it is, and so we let it be.